Are we live?
We are, Chair Kaplan.
Well, welcome everyone to I believe our fourth meeting. I'd like to see you all. I'm not able to see you all from my screen, but I can see enough of you. Thank you all for your patience and your support. Here's what we're going to do today. My goal is in the first part of the meeting to complete the discussion and to have a vote on how we will treat the constitutional officers. Then we will talk about department or agency heads. I believe our action will be no action at that time, but we will discuss it. Then we will have a discussion about the judges, and I emphasize a discussion, not a decision to be made, because as we will explain later, there's going to be a meeting of the Judicial Council on March 18th, and the earlier action they've taken may be modified, and that may influence our thinking. We will then have a meeting of this group on the 19th of March, at which time we will make all final decisions concerning the judiciary. Sometime between now and then, you will receive the draft of the report of our committee, and it will be as complete as possible at that time. Much of it is already done. So with that in mind, we are going to move to the discussion of the constitutional officers.
Mr. Chair, would you like to adopt the minutes from the last meeting?
Oh, I think that would be a wonderful idea.
Okay.
Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move those, that we approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Byerly second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Is there anyone who would vote no? If not, the motion is carried. Sally, will you tell us whether we have a quorum?
Yes, there is a quorum of members present.
Thank you very much. 14 of the 16, and now all 16?
15 of the 16.
Thank you very much. So let us talk about the constitutional officers. It is a challenge. As you know, I've been discussing with you, the challenge is that we want to be heard by the legislature, but we want to be practical at the same time. So what I'm suggesting to you today is that we have a straw poll on three alternatives that I have selected in consultation with Gail, as we have considered what are the approaches that we might take that have various pluses and minuses. So we have three possibilities. I will speak to the first two, and Gail will speak to the third. We will then have a poll of our group. This is not a formal motion yet. And as we poll the group and you say how you will vote on this tentative vote, you will also be free to make any comments you have concerning it. Option one for us to consider is a one-time change in compensation for the constitutional officers of 4%. This is logical. We had considered the 4% as an alternative in our meeting, our last meeting. And that was a compromise. There was some unhappiness about the 4%, but it does have the compelling quality of getting the attention of the legislature in a way that perhaps others have less ability, because it is one time and it is not so significant. The downside, of course, is that it is one time, and it is not so very significant. And so we have to have in mind the obvious, that we may make it easy for the legislature and we may not hear their action again. At about the time that we were talking about that, they were indicating to us that we have a second budget report indicating that we will now have a surplus. And that brings me to the second alternative. Second alternative I present to you would be that we have two annual fixes, or increases in the constitutional officers' compensation of 3.5% each. The advantage of it, of course, is that it is more than the 4%. It is a greater increase in the compensation. Another advantage is the rhythm of it is similar to what was done in 2013, when the salaries were increased by 3% each for 2015 and 2016. So the appeal of it is, the substance of it is greater than the 4%, of course. The downside is the obvious. It may or may not get the same attention as the 4%, and it may be thought to be too large. So balancing the interest is something that we have to take into account. Now, in both of these, and there'll be a more formal motion on the point I'm going to make now, in both of these, it would be our intention to propose that the compensation of the Secretary of State of the state of Minnesota and the compensation of the auditor of the state of Minnesota would be equalized. There seems no logical reason why the Secretary of State should be at a lower level, which by no means is a reflection on the excellent work of the auditor, but these are comparable positions and they should be compensated for at that level. So I present to you the first two options. One is a 4% one-time increase. The other is two annual allocations of 3.5% each. Now I turn to our Vice Chair, Gail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, to be realistic, if we're going to try to be realistic, I understand that there's not going to be a majority support for option 3. And the numbers that the Compensation Council offered in 2019, Greg, you probably have those somewhere, but they were in between the option 2 and option 3 numbers, about halfway in between there. That was a compromise offered at the time. And as I thought about the whole process, which I think has had its frustrations, it occurred to me that what we really need to be looking at is a different method for determining the salaries of the constitutional officers. We had some discussion about that at the last meeting. And Mr. Chair, I can offer my motion whenever, but we could go ahead and take the straw poll on options, on these options at this time, if you'd like to do that, and I can make my motion later.
Well, are you talking about option 3 being one that would take into account inflation in the future, or are you focusing just on what the increase would be based upon inflation from 2003?
The numbers in option 3 reflect simply inflationary increases since 2003. So but I'm not proposing that at this time because I don't think there's support for it. And I think that would be a huge leap. It would be hard for probably most people to countenance such a significant increase. So my proposal, which I won't make as a motion just yet, is that the council recommend to the legislature that constitutional officers receive, going forward, inflationary increases based on, I think it's the consumer price index that's used in the statute for agency head range changes. And that the compensation council have removed from it the responsibility for making recommendations on constitutional officers. There's a chart that Greg or Michelle can maybe, or Sally can put up that demonstrates what's gone on over the past 20 years. In 2001, there were structural changes made to the compensation plan. Thank you, that's it. And those took effect in 2003. In the 20 years since 2001, when those changes were adopted, judges have received salary increases in 13 of the years. The administrative agency heads' salary ranges change every year, as I understand it, because the range is adjusted for the consumer price index. Whether a salary changes is up to the governor as long as it's within that range. But for the 5 constitutional officer, the only changes were those that Sam mentioned earlier, 3% in 2015 and 3% in 2016. And otherwise, no action has been taken. And I think that's because of the same kinds of reasons that affected not being able to get legislative salaries increased. It's politically dead in the water. It's very challenging to get attention to the issue because it doesn't have a natural constituent base. It's not similar to, for example, even the judges or the agency heads, where I think it's easier to draw comparisons to public and private sector roles. It's always easier to just overlook those kinds of changes. And I think that will continue to be true unless there's a change in the approach. And I think there needs to be, I can't imagine what the rationale is for paying the way the current salaries are set based on factors that were devised in 2001. I don't know what a rationale for that would be. So that is my proposal, Mr. Chair, and perhaps we can consider that after you take your straw poll on the other options.
Well, I would rather include that as one of the options.
Okay, all right.
So Sally, let's take the screen down, if you will. Sally, let's call the roll. And what I would ask you to do is to comment as you wish, as you vote, indicating whether you favor alternative 1, which is a 4% increase, alternative 2, 2 annual increases of 3.5%, or alternative 3, which is basically turn the entire system into one that is controlled by increases in the cost of living and move the control of the setting of salaries to the legislature from this council. Senator Cohen, you had a question? I see your hand up.
I was on mute, sorry. Is the Secretary of State addendum part of all the proposals or just the 3.5 proposal?
I don't want to complicate things, Dick. If you want that to be a separate vote, we will.
Not necessarily. I was just asking for clarification on what you presented to us.
It was my intention it would be part of all of the proposals. Mr. Weaver, you have a question or observation?
Just a quick question of staff. As I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, but does the statute say that they're looking for us to make recommendations for 23 and 24? So this would be moving it up because we're talking about 22, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Right.
Mr. Chair, the statute does ask for the effective date of the recommendation to be January 1st of 2023. And the recommendation could also include an additional increase on January 1st, 2024. However, previous councils have included recommendations with different timeframes.
And I would remind you, Charlie, that when they did act in 2013, I believe it was, they disregarded the instructions.
Yep. Thank you. I just wasn't sure whether we had that flexibility. I want to confirm that.
Sally,
Chair Kaplan, did you want to go first or do you want me to go alphabetical?
I vote for alternative two annual increases of 3.5%. I think it's a balancing of the interests. It's not a significant amount, but it is a major step forward. There is some risk in it being less well received at the level of the legislature, but I think it is the appropriate way to go.
David Asp,
I would vote, of those three, I'd vote for the first option, the single increase. And my reasoning is just sort of a reflection of my experience over the last 2 times we've done this. We've put recommendations out there that have I think generally, as my understanding, fallen on deaf ears and haven't gotten traction. So I think that just on the numbers, keeping it simple is the best approach. So that's my rationale for the number 1.
Kathy Brown. Kathy, you're on mute.
Sorry. I vote for Gail Olson's proposal of a different method where constitutional officers are annually given a CPI increase and they would be removed from this council's responsibility.
Dick Cohen.
I would vote for number 2. I think I had expressed at the prior meeting I like matching.
Great, I couldn't hear.
I like matching what our proposal is relative to number 2 with what generally is done with public employees and the bargaining groups.
Annie Deckert. Annie. Sean Dowse.
So I vote for option 2. I really like the idea of the 3.5 and 3.5. It sort of starts building the idea that there could be annual increases, if not based on a recommendation like 3.5, but as an inflationary increase in subsequent years. So I like the steps going forward as a kind of a model and a paradigm for increases. Thank you.
Jim Fox.
I'm going to go for option 2, parodying what the others have commented on option 2. I'm not in favor of option 3 because I'm not in favor of giving the legislature a pass on making a decision.
Pete Gregory.
I would support a hybrid, but you can put my vote in Vice Chair Olson's column. I would support the CPI tethering, but I would also support before that indexed adjustment takes place that we would or that the legislature would make an increase similar to option 2, 3.5% increases. And my reasoning for that would be, if we implement a CPI tethering now, assuming all the other states remain the same, basically our constitutional officers would be locked into the bottom third.
Noah Hobbs. Noah Hobbs. Amanda Matchett.
I support Vice Chair Olson's proposal. Taking politics and all of that out of it, as an employee, I would expect and think it's reasonable to receive a CPI increase each year. I think that constitutional officers should reasonably expect the same.
Kathy Meyerly.
I would support choice 2, but with the consideration being given that we indicate after the second increase, which is going to be 1/1/23, there be the inflationary increases going along with it.
Bob Meyerson.
I support number 3 for 2 reasons. One is that this council has been ignored all of this time. I don't know why that would change going forward. So if the legislature had the ability to do this, maybe they'd be happier that way. But also, I think that the cost of living adjustment is a strong argument. It's hard to argue against giving somebody at least a cost of living adjustment. And if I were on the receiving end of this, I guess I would settle for that, though I understand the argument that this would lock increases in.
Gail Olson.
Well, of course, I'm going to support option 3, but it would be helpful after this discussion if we could actually put the language on top, because I also like the idea of option 2, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think Pete and Kathy, maybe Amanda also talked about that. And Bob, I'm not sure if you addressed that or not, but if we made the 3.5 and 3.5 effective on July 1 of this year and July 1 of next year, then the statutory change embedding the cost of living increase could take effect on January 1st of 23 and be consistent with the directive from the legislature to give a recommendation on that time. So I think those 2 could be done together.
Scott Van Binsbergen.
I would support option 1, and for many reasons, but I guess one reason, I think these people that are in these positions, they didn't run for the position for the money or the pay. And sometimes in life you get paid less and then you make more later on. And I've run for office and I never thought about the pay. I was interested in the job because I wanted to serve and give back. And so I'd be a supporter of option 1.
Charlie Weaver.
I like what Scott said, but I'm going to vote for number 2. I think that's a fair compromise. I prefer 3 and 3 myself, but I understand that compromise is part of the process. So I'm okay with number 2. I really don't like number 3 because it takes away the ability of the legislature to react to good times and bad times. As I look over the history that we got about judges, Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, etc., some years they got 1.5, some years they got 4, some years they got 2.5. I think if we fell on really hard economic times, I just don't think that we should lock ourselves in or lock future legislatures into spending like this. They should keep that flexibility. I think that's healthy and it holds them accountable, as someone else said. So that's why I'm for number 2.
Nick Zerwas?
Yes. I think for me, the big thing, I think I'll echo a lot of what Charlie said, but I think the big thing is the legislature is going to want and demand that flexibility. And so I think anything that we put forth that seems to try to box in the legislature, I think is going to not be received as warmly as perhaps some other options. But I think for me, it's a tough situation because I think after seeing the information that we're presented, it becomes pretty clear just how much ground there is to make up. And so I think putting something forward that is aggressive, and maybe they don't go the whole 9 yards, but I think at least it gets people's attention. I think we have to do something that shows just how drastically we've begun to fall behind and how significant of a problem it's becoming.
Excuse me, I couldn't hear your first few words. Were you saying that you favored the 3.5% increases?
Yes. Yep. I think that's, I mean, I think it gets us at least moving in the right direction.
So there would be 2 for the 4%, 7 for the number 2, and Kathy Meyerly, I was including you with number 2 because you started, when you started, you said you were at 2. Okay. And then 5 for the option 3.
You know, I actually got different numbers there.
Did you? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I maybe got it wrong. For option 1, 2. For option 2, I understood there were 9. And
7.
for option 3, I understood there were 6.
That would bring us to
My
17.
numbers agreed with Sally.
Okay, so I have, for option 2, I have Sam, Dick, Sean, Jim, Pete,
He was
Kathy
3.
Kathy Meyerly, me, Charlie, and Nick. Right? Are those all right?
Well, Pete, Gail, and you were 3 with extra language about not having those mutually exclusive. So
Oh, okay, so that's where the difference is, because I understood 3 of us at least to say, do both option 2 and option 3. Can I make one clarification on the motion, the language of which you haven't seen? And it would have a safety valve that says the legislature can undo the consumer price index change whenever, for each year it wants to do that.
Would you like me to share that language?
I'll leave that up to Sam. Is this good timing for that?
Let me hear from the people who have their hands up. Amanda?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond to Charlie's comment about adjusting when times are tough. That's what CPI does. So CPI is based on economic factors. So if there's a lower economic time or downturn or a recession, the CPI is going to reflect that. And then Gail, like Gail mentioned, there's going to be a safety valve that the legislature can always override that as well. So I really think this plan actually takes all of those factors in consideration.
Dick, Cone?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that as we're determining language relative to a cost of living increase, whether if it's going to be a recommendation to the legislature that this has to be done every year, keep in mind that constitutionally, one session of the legislature cannot constitutionally bind a subsequent session of the legislature. So we can make the recommendation, but language would have to be couched, not in constitutional terms, but understanding that we can't mandate the legislature do this year after year, nor can we recommend the legislature pass legislation mandating that we do this year after year. That's simply not constitutional.
We'd have to make sure the language reflected that. You're right. I agree.
But Dick, in 2013, when you were there, you agreed with the recommendation of this council for 2 separate years.
Well, 2 separate years would be the biennial budget. So that would be the session of the legislature. But a future legislature.
You're talking about the cost of living increase.
Yes. Yeah. And there's nothing to keep the council from making that recommendation to the legislature. This is the way you ought to do it. Always do something with a cost of living increase. But we can't recommend. I would say it should be inadvisable to recommend the legislature that this is a mandate that you should put in the statute. You have to do this year after year because constitutionally they can't. But it's a 2-year session.
And I think your concern is absolutely right, and I think it can be addressed in the actual language.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me as if the sense of the group, there's a majority for the 3.5% increase. It's not quite clear to me whether there is a majority for adding as an add-on to that, the cost of living motion as you identified, Gail.
Would you like me to make the motion on the 3.5 and 3.5 so we can go ahead and vote on that? Are people ready?
By all means.
So-
Go for it.
And are we clear about when those 2 would be effective? Would those be July 1 of this year and July 1 of next year? Is that what we're recommending for the 3.5 and 3.5?
That is not what was on the chart. The chart
Okay.
said 1/1/22 and 1/1/23.
Okay, all right. So that would be the motion then. 3.5 on 1/1/22 and 3.5 on 1/1/23.
Sally, call the roll.
Do you need a second or no?
Meyerly seconds.
And there's no inflation with this, Gail, is that right?
No, the question is whether there will be a act on the second motion that would add an inflation component on top of the 3.5%.
Separate. Separate. Yeah.
Separate.
Got it. Thank you.
Chair Kaplan,
Yes.
David Asp,
Yes.
Kathy Brown,
Yes.
Dick Cohen,
Yes.
Annie Deckert, Sean Dowse,
Yes.
Jim Fox,
No.
Peter Gregory,
Yes.
Noah Hobbs, Amanda Matchett,
No.
Kathy Meyerly,
Yes.
Bob Meyerson,
Yes.
Gail Olson,
Yes.
Scott Van Binsbergen,
No.
Charlie Weaver,
Yes.
Nick Zerwas,
Yes.
Noah Hobbs, $11 yes, 3 no.
The motion carries. Now the floor is open, Gail, for your second motion.
All right, I would ask, Sally, do you have that motion? Can you put that up on the screen?
I think Michelle
Michelle,
has it.
someone?
Yep, I can do that.
Okay.
Oh, my apologies. Sorry about this.
The actual motion is just, oh, lost that again.
We can
I'm
see it,
sorry.
Michelle.
You could see it? Okay, I'm sorry.
The actual motion, when it gets back up, is just the recommendation part. The background is just to provide background and context for why I'm proposing it.
Are you able to see it now?
Yes.
So read it out loud, Gail, the recommendation part.
That the legislature adopt legislation providing that salaries of constitutional officers shall increase annually by the percentage increase, if any, in the consumer price index for all urban consumers from October of the second prior year to October of the immediately prior year, unless the legislature takes action to establish other salary amounts. Further, that Minnesota statute section 15A-082 be amended to remove the constitutional officer salaries from the responsibilities of the Compensation Council. And I will note, just for information, that that language about the consumer price index in October to October is just the language taken from the legislation governing the agency head salary increase, range increases.
Now, Gail, you're actually making two motions. The section that starts with further is really a separate motion.
Well, I'm making it as one motion because I think if the first one is adopted, the second one follows. So I think they're of a piece, but I can separate them if that would be preferable.
But you're making, it has three parts. It has the basic part, and then it has the part that says the legislature, unless the legislature takes action to establish other salary amounts. And then thirdly, you're saying you're removing this from the purview of the Compensation Council. You want them all in one motion?
Yes, I actually look at the first sentence as one idea, that it will increase unless the legislature takes action. So I think those are, again, a piece that those go together. And if we adopt a recommendation that says there will be a annual increase, then it's unnecessary for the Compensation Council to review constitutional officer salaries. That's my thinking.
That's true, but it's also true that if the legislature takes action to establish other salary amounts and then routinely decides that the other salary amounts are zero, it leaves the battlefield empty of people who are advocates.
Well, that's true. It's true. I would be happy to separate out the further clause. So I'll make the motion on the first part through establish other salary amounts.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second it.
Sally, call the roll.
Chair Kaplan,
First, there should be discussion, right?
Absolutely, Bob. Speak up.
The question of for all urban consumers, there are many different ways that the consumer price index is calculated. So to avoid quibbling down the road, I think it should be specified. Maybe Jim Fox knows the many different ways it's done, but I'm thinking if there is one for Minnesota urban consumers, Minnesota, that word should be put in there.
You know, Bob, I just lifted language from 15A-082, which uses this language with regard to agency head salary ranges. So I wasn't trying, I wanted to use something that already existed in statute because I wanted to avoid making something up. I know there'd be a variety of measures that could be used, but this is already in the same statute.
So then we leave it open and it can be quibbled?
Well, maybe Greg or Michelle could comment on whether that's been an issue in the past. I'm not aware that it is, but.
Mr. Chair and members, as Gail indicated, that's the language that the Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget currently uses for determining the increase in salary ranges for agency heads. I understand that the department uses the CPIU for the US. And under Gail's language, the process for these increases would be the same as for the heads of state agency salary ranges.
I'd like to ask Jim Fox his opinion on that. Is that the way to go?
Bob, I'm afraid that you probably didn't want to open up that Pandora's box.
I wanted to close it.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I agree with Gail. This is already established. It's been used before. It's kind of accepted as the appropriate measure. I just have a fundamentally academic disagreement with using the consumer price index for adjusting salaries, because I think that what you're buying is labor. You're not buying food and gas and housing and that sort of thing. And that's what's in the consumer price index. A better index, in my opinion, is the cost of labor index. It is
Jim, we can't hear you.
mute. You couldn't hear me?
Now we can.
Did you hear anything?
Yes.
So the cost of labor index really tracks salary changes across the country, much like the consumer price index tracks the cost of goods and services across the country. It tends to track on it's fairly well correlated with the consumer price index, but there's a lag. So if the consumer price index goes up 4%, it might be a year or two before the cost of labor goes up. When the cost of the consumer price index goes down, it may be a year or two after that the cost of labor goes down. Having made all of that explanation, I probably would go with the consumer price index because it's an established precedent in the state.
Thank you. Are there other comments before we vote on this?
Now, I made a question
Yes, Charlie.
for Gail. I know that the CPI is used for salary ranges. Are there any, this is though a specific amount, it would go up every year. Is that currently applied to any other state employees? Judges or legislators or state employees?
I'm not aware of whether it does or not. Of course, I suppose the bulk of state employees are subject to bargaining agreements. And so any increases would be established in those. And then other employees are subject to various plans. And so I know I'm not aware that those would increase by the consumer price index. So I don't know whether there's another parallel.
Thank you.
Just to comment on, there probably isn't a parallel, but in bargaining, it's usually the consumer price index is considered in the bargaining process.
Mm-hmm.
They may agree to a lower amount. Hardly ever do they agree to a larger amount.
I have to say, I'm not as concerned about the vehicle. And I appreciate what Jim and Bob were talking about. I'd be happy to insert a different index if it didn't cause more trouble and create yet another standard. But another way to do it, for example, might be to take the average increase, if there is such a thing, of bargaining agreements? Is there something like that, Greg or Michelle? Oh, sorry.
Looking at the average of the across the board increases in contracts has been considered. And there was one set of increases provided in law that took the average of those increases. I can't remember if the Comp Council has ever made that specific recommendation. One policy reason that has been used for not using that standard is that to the extent that agency heads have some influence on bargaining as management, there is a subtle conflict there that they may benefit from larger increases in contracts and plans indirectly.
Let me ask some of our former legislators whether you believe that adding this to the 3.5% diminishes the chances of the 3.5% for 2 years being approved at the legislature, or is it, if they oppose it, that they will simply knock off this portion of the resolution? Charlie?
I think it makes it less likely it would pass.
Altogether?
Yeah, if it's all tied together, I think adding this would be a bridge too far for most legislators.
Dick Cohn?
I would agree with Charlie's comment that given the difficulty with compensation council recommendations in the past, this would make it a little bit easier to ignore. The other concern I have as I listen now to the language is I think that it walks right up to the line of my constitutional concern. And I realize, this is not the legislature. But if this language was on the floor of the Senate and somebody raised a move that it was out of order, I think it'd be difficult not to sustain that motion.
Are there other comments or questions?
I think the comment I would make is that despite many recommendations made by past compensation councils, the legislature has been very adept at picking which ones they're interested in and which ones they're not. So, for example, last time around, judicial salary increases were made, but constitutional officer salary increases were not made. So I think making that recommendation, I'm not a legislator, obviously you all know more about that, but it's hard to see why in this one instance, it would be the downfall of the 3.5% if we moved it forward.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond briefly to that.
Surely.
First of all, let me make it clear. I'm sympathetic to the language. And all the years I spent in the legislature, I would have to guess I supported just about every pay raise that showed up, whether it was for constitutional officers, legislators, judges, public employees. I'd have to think very hard if I opposed anything. And recognize, as Gail mentions, that given the fact that the legislature has found it very easy in the past to ignore recommendations of this council, should we present our pure proposal, our best proposal, irrespective of legislative concerns? I would like to think, given the thoughtfulness I've heard from this council in the meetings I've participated in, and to be honest, if I were to contrast this to years ago when I was on the council as a legislative member, I think the conversations of these council meetings, despite being held up by Zoom, have been very, very thoughtful. I'd hope some of that might be conveyed to the legislature by the chair and the vice chair in testimony before appropriate committees. My concern is relative to what Charlie mentioned, is just given the volatility of these issues. And that's just the simple reality. Which side do we come down on? Make a presentation of what is our optimum, or do we err on the side of hoping we might have an impact on the legislature? I would also, if I might, if you don't mind, in response to your legitimate comment about other places, there's been success with salary increases. You know, part of that, to be real blunt, is just sheer politics. The judiciary has been very effective in making their case, and to be blunt, what they do is they bring in former legislators who are judges to talk to all their former colleagues, in addition to people from the various district benches to talk to legislators of that geography. That's been going on for years. Obviously, with public employees, you have very large bargaining units represented by significant unions, AFSCME, for instance, and you know, that's a very effective lobbying force. So that's a recognition of, and legislative salaries. You know, I was there for the presentation on this constitutional amendment that passed several years ago that took legislators out of legislative action. And there was, I can just tell you, a lot of cleverness about that from those who presented it to the legislature, at least on the Senate side. I'd sure like to think that the legislature might at some point do the right thing relative to this. And could there be an opportunity this year, given the fact that the budget forecast is pretty decent? And when the federal money comes in from the stimulus package, I think that's going to be around, albeit one-time money, somewhere around 2.5, 2.6 billion. The legislature is going to be awash in money. Would that allow them to do something realistic to at least get these salaries set on the right road? So that's a longer discussion. I apologize for that, but I just, separate from, you know, former senator, as a lawyer, I could easily argue a brief on either side. But I'd like to think if we go to the legislature and allow the chair, the vice chair, to make a strong presentation and arguably raise this issue, but the recommendation be something that just maybe they might give some consideration to, maybe might take it out of politics of you know, which particular individual has which particular office today.
Well,
that would be Pollyannish on my part.
would it help if we changed the approach and said that the legislature consider language rather than adopt language?
Is that directed toward myself, Sam? Or?
I take what you and Charlie say very seriously. I mean, I want to have a shot at getting something passed, and I don't want to diminish the possibility. And you're saying this is, as much as you like it, this is excess baggage.
Well, certainly softening the language might be an improvement, a political improvement, not necessarily an improvement substantively, but a political improvement. I'd be curious. I don't know if it's not quite fair. You never call on people, having chaired committees there for many years, you never call on people if they're not looking to jump into it. I'd be very curious to hear former Representative Sirwas's perspective on the House.
Yeah, and I think your words of caution, I think that are going for me are well taken, in that I think at any point, I mean, you served a lot longer than I did, but in my 4 terms, at any point something came that tried to get one legislature to bind the following biennium out into a commitment becomes pretty challenging. If I think putting something forward like that, is there a way, and do you think it would be well taken, instead of going, is there a way to basically show it out instead of saying in perpetuity, what if we block out kind of a 4-year process? So then the increases could at least be tracked in the next biennium's budget and then the tails projection for that budget. So at least what we would be asking them to move forward on would at least all be reflective in an actual spreadsheet for the finance committee. And I haven't heard if the finance chair, the Ways and Means chair in the House are going to have tails targets for their budgets as they put forward. But that thought came to my mind is if instead of saying in perpetuity, we index this thing, what if we ask them to commit to 4 years? So at least to that degree, those set increases could be tracked on the budget sheet that MMB and everybody's working off of. And for tails targets, everyone's on the same page. That's kind of the thought that I had, Senator.
Are you suggesting that the third and fourth year after the 3.5% each would be a fixed amount, like 3.5%, or would be based on the consumer price index?
Well, I think I know there was another idea of kind of hooking it to the CPI, and I think whatever you do, whatever the ask is going forward, I would be hesitant to ask for that to occur in a longer window than those 4 years, because as you project out further than that, it drops off the budget worksheets and the tracking document that the chairs and everybody's using. So then, in their mind, you might as well be asking them to commit for 100 years. But if it's 4 years, it's all on one document. It can all be tracked. Now, obviously, the legislature sets out programs that kind of go in perpetuity, and those expenses are tracked on an ongoing process, and you see that in the tails spending. And so I wonder if it's a way to approach it like that. And so we're not asking somebody to do this forever, but we are asking or suggesting that they really take a commitment at this point. All that being said, the next set of majorities could come in, and any legislature can change any budget they want.
Sure.
So I think that needs to be fully understood. But I think if we keep it to 4 years, or at least keeping it on the budget document and within the spreadsheet and purview of that finance chair and his or her committee.
So I'm
Just the thought that I had.
are you saying for the third and fourth year of your program, the amount would be fixed? Would it be 3.5% for 4 years?
That's, whether it's 3.5% or 4%, or if it's if it's front loaded but I think for me, the biggest thing is to try to get buy-in at the legislature to identify how far behind we've gotten, and to try as best we can to get folks to commit to the 4 years of spending. And so book the spending, put it on the spreadsheet, and go forward with it. So I just think whether it's the hooking it to the CPI or whether it's the fixed amount, I think where you're going to step in it and have trouble is if you try to do something that, in my mind, I think where you'd have trouble is if you try to extend it so it falls off of that budget spreadsheet, kind of in no man's land. Then I think just kind of mentally, the legislature says, well, they're asking us to promise to do this forever. and we can't commit to that.
But you don't think adding a third and fourth year diminishes the possibility of getting it for the first and second year?
I mean, the challenge is, as Senator Cohen brought up the idea of the state flushing cash now. If you're going to spend, the challenges with anything we do with this, it's not one-time money. It's ongoing money. And so, that's the challenge with all this. Even with the new relief money and everything coming in, that's kind of one-time influxes of cash. We're asking the legislature to commit to permanent ongoing spending. And so conservative Republican former legislator Nick would say you can't set a budget for ongoing spending based on one-term money.
So maybe I really appreciate all the insights that both of you have just shared. Maybe a compromise would be to keep it in the normal framework of the Compensation Council. We're expected or requested to make recommendations for 1/1/23, and we can make a recommendation for 1/1/24. But based on what you're saying, maybe we could at least do a 3-year window. So on 1/1/22, we would recommend the 3.5% increase. 1/1/23, the second 3.5% increase, and then 1/1/24, make an increase based on the CPI index. That would be a way of extending the impact one more year, without getting into the other issues that you and Senator Cohen have both expressed concerns about.
Are others to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, I've done a lot of talking. I apologize, but Nick's proposal has some appeal, and I think it's a pretty good idea to the extent that, and just so everybody understands, when the legislature budgets, again, you can't constitutionally bind the next legislature. But at least in terms of the fiscal issues, you look at the so-called out years, not the biennium you're budgeting for, which is the next biennium starting July 1st of this year for the 2-year period. But you look at the tails budget for the subsequent 2 years. And just an aside, it was a reform of Arnie Carlson, which was the best fiscal reform I saw over the years I was there, to take a look at what happens next. And the legislature is supposed to balance the tails budget. I have no idea. The fiscal staff right now, the chairs would have some sense of what a tails budget looks like. I wouldn't have a clue as to what a tails budget looks like at this point. But as Nick Zerwas points out, that's something that we're used to dealing with. And there certainly are legislators who don't pay close attention to the tails budget. The folks who are the finance chairs, the fiscal analysts, the people at MMB absolutely have to pay attention to that. So that's language that we're very familiar with. And so I do think that it has some appeal.
Mr. Chair, I would just like it to be noted in the record, it's not often that a member, that a senator says that a House member or even a former House member had a good idea. So I just want that noted in the record.
I said, keep in mind, I'm a former House member, albeit many, many years ago.
Fair enough, Senator, fair enough.
Are there others who would be heard?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, David.
I have just a question for Gail. Are you suggesting an amended proposal that would just simply add a year? So it'd be the 2 years that we just voted to approve plus then adding a third year at the CPI of October in that year. Is that the
Yeah.
amendment? Okay. I mean, that
That
strikes me
is,
as,
that was what I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, if that's, I'm understanding it right, that addresses the concern I had with it, which was just sort of setting it on a course to increase in perpetuity. And I think leaving it with this council to make the decision is consistent with what we've been asked to do and seems acceptable. Maybe that does lay a groundwork for future increases if we consider the next 2 years, the 3%, 3.25% rates as sort of catch up. And then going forward, looking at it from CPI. So
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable amendment.
So are you proposing that we change what we just approved to make it for 3 years instead of 2 years?
Mr. Chair, procedurally, the
Yeah,
previous motion passed, authorizing the 3.5% on 1/1/22 and 1/1/23. The current motion that's on the table is the information that you see before you. So Gail, you would need to withdraw the motion, and then a new motion could be made for the CPI increase on 1/1/24.
I'm willing to withdraw the motion. I don't hear that there's a groundswell of support for going this way, so. Although I think it was a brilliant idea, I don't know.
And very artfully done, Gail. Very artfully done.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll just mention, in my perfect world, I like the idea. In my perfect world. But
Already, yeah. All right, so is there now a motion that we extend for another year, the 3.5%?
Mr. Chair, this is Kathy Meyerly. I think the motion I would like to see is that the salaries be further adjusted on 1/1/24 to reflect the CPI as described in the printed motion that was withdrawn.
But are you saying that that would be for 1 year or forevermore?
No, it's just for 1 year. I think the sense of the discussion that I heard is going out beyond year 3 is not something that would be well received at the legislature.
Are there further comments? Gail, I assume that's your new resolution.
That is, exactly. So we would add on 1/1/24, we would recommend that the salary be adjusted in accordance with the CPI. We'll find the language, right? But yeah,
Is it 1/1/24?
right. We've already done 1/1/22 and 1/1/23. And 1/1/24 is still within the biennium that this council would normally make recommendations for. So it doesn't get us beyond that
For
date.
3 years, 3.5 the first 2 years, and the consumer price index the next. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Call the roll.
Chair Kaplan,
Yes.
David Asp,
Yes.
Kathy Brown,
Yes.
Dick Cohen,
yes,
Annie Deckert, Sean Dowse,
Yes.
Jim Fox,
No.
Pete Gregory,
Yes.
Noah Hobbs, Amanda Matchett,
Yes.
Kathy Meyerly,
Yes.
Bob Meyerson,
Yes.
Gail Olson,
Yes,
Scott Van Binsbergen,
No.
Charlie Weaver,
No,
Nick Zerwas,
Yes.
11 yes, 3 no.
The motion passes. Gail, to be sure that we have our bases covered, make a motion concerning the Secretary of State.
All right. I will move that we recommend to the legislature that the Secretary of State's salary be commensurate with that of the state auditor. Effective, I would say effective July 1, 21.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Is there discussion? Sally, call the roll.
Chair Kaplan,
Yes.
David
I
Asp,
think, sorry to interrupt. Gail, I think you indicated that the salary would be comparable on July 1 of 21.
Yeah? Is that bad?
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I withdraw.
I voted yes. Who was second?
David Asp,
Yes.
Kathy Brown,
Yes.
Dick Cohen,
Yes.
Annie Deckert, Sean Dowse,
Yes.
Jim Fox,
Yes.
Peter Gregory,
Yes.
Noah Hobbs, Amanda Matchett,
Yes.
Kathy Meyerly,
Yes.
Bob Meyerson,
Yes.
Gail Olson,
Yes.
Scott Van Binsbergen,
No.
Charlie Weaver,
Yes.
Nick Zerwas,
Yes.
Now,
13 yes, 1 no.
the motion
There's
passes. Does that require a separate motion to eliminate the coupling? Or does that take care of it?
Mr. Chair, I wonder if Greg Hubinger maybe could respond. My understanding is that the salaries are not coupled with the governors, but I could have that wrong.
Mr. Chair and members, the percentages were adopted in legislation passed in 2001 or 3. There's nothing that prevents this council from making its salary recommendations as it is. So we can just, there's nothing that legally couples the salaries.
Okay. Thank you all very much for that. I appreciate it. I think it's a sound solution. Greg, tell us the status of department head salaries and how they've been treated. I can't hear you.
Mr. Chair, I'm just going to pop up the salary history for agency heads, which is a document that you've seen in a prior meeting. Let me make that a little bit easier to read. So the council's responsibility is to make recommendations on salary ranges. I'm gonna scroll down here.
Isn't it the case that people are currently earning less than the top of the ranges?
Yes, Mr. Chair, the ranges are shown on this spreadsheet. For most agencies, the maximum is 185,000. The top paid commissioner is at 154,000. So there's roughly a $30,000 window that the governor has where the governor can increase the salaries without exceeding the current salary limit.
Why the question I asked the committee or the council is why would we want to increase the maximum when the maximum is not close to being reached and the governor shows no intention of moving in that direction? Are there comments or responses?
I agree with that, and especially given the earlier comments about not kind of watering down the recommendations we care about, that this one would be kind of pyrrhic. It's pointless.
Is there a motion that we take no further action with regard to the department head salaries, agency leads?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Sally?
Chair Kaplan,
Yes.
David Asp,
Yes.
Kathy Brown,
Yes.
Dick Cohen,
Yes.
Annie Deckert, Sean Dowse,
Yes.
Jim Fox,
Yes.
Peter Gregory,
Yes.
Noah Hobbs, Amanda Matchett,
Yes.
Kathy Meyerly,
Yes.
Bob Meyerson,
Yes.
Gail Olson,
Yes.
Scott Van Binsbergen,
Yes.
Charlie Weaver,
Yes.
Nick Zerwas.
Yes.
14 yes, 0 no.
Passed. Let us then move on to the matter of the judicial salaries. Greg, put up on the screen whatever information would be helpful. He's got about 6 different versions.
Mr. Chair, do you want the set of salaries, possible salaries that was sent to the council? Or do you want the narrower set of options that you thought you wanted to present as the chair?
Let's see both.
This is what, Mr. Chair, members, this is are the 2 options that have been considered so far. We have the current salaries on the left. Under option 1 are the salaries that would result that are included in the Supreme Court's budget request and now included in the governor's budget proposal. 0% in the first year and a 3% increase in July of 22. At the last meeting, you heard a presentation by the Minnesota District Court Judges Association and their consultant. They recommended a series of increases of 5% and 5% and 4% for the next 4 years. And those salaries are shown here.
And what do you understand is going to happen on March 18th?
Mr. Chair, I understand. I'll defer to Michelle on this one.
I apologize. Could you repeat the question?
What do you understand is going to happen on March 18th?
On March 18th, it's my understanding that the group is going to meet and determine whether or not they're going to revise their recommendation or their request to the legislature and the governor related to the 0% on July 1st of 2021 and the 3% on July 1st of 22.
Mr. Chair, I was able to talk to Chief Justice Gilday earlier today about her expectations for this. And she said she really can't predict at this point because the Judicial Council will be making the recommendation about what action to take, if any.
At the time that I spoke to Judge Hoffman, who was acting on behalf of the District Court Judges Association, he told me that they would live with the 3%. They had other ideas about why it should be higher. That was before the budget surplus surfaced. And the presentation that was made at our meeting by the judicial group was somewhat confusing. I only express my own opinion now. As a lawyer, it seems to me that those numbers for 2022 are substantial. I would have to hear a compelling case beyond that of the consultants that I would favor increasing. That's my personal view, but I'd like to hear the view of others. But if the Supreme Court, if the council has a different request budget request, there's no reason why we would resist what the governor decides to put in his budget. Comments or questions? This is not a shy group, I've come to understand.
Mr. Chair, aren't we muddying the waters by weighing in on this before we know what the Judicial Council will recommend?
I agree with you. That's why I said we won't take any action until March 19th, but I wanted you to hear my view as to what I regard to be the current state of affairs.
Mr. Chair, another thing that I have some concerns about, I'm all for a strong judiciary and making sure we're able to attract candidates from both the private sector and the public sector. Having said that, I think it would be helpful to understand why judicial salaries should be at the 18th or 19th or 20th rank for other states, but our other constitutional officers should be at the 30th or 35th or 38th level. And whether we have sort of a compensation philosophy about where Minnesota should be. I put that out as a question.
Well, let me ask the legislators, the former legislators in our group. Traditionally, the legislature has been more friendly towards judges. Isn't that true? Charlie?
Charlie had to drop off.
Dick?
For another meeting.
Yeah. In my experience,
They're more friendly to judges.
in the time that I was in the legislature, certainly.
Dick Cohn?
The answer is yes. The judiciary tends to be viewed as, to be blunt, less political, less partisan than the other positions. So it's been easier. And recently, I'll just tell you that having been around, I don't know, 5 or 6, 7, I don't know what it is, Chief Justices, going back to Chief Justice Amdahl, back when I was in the House, this Chief Justice is without question the strongest advocate among the chiefs I've ever seen at the Capitol. She's very, very effective and very, very forceful. And that's made a difference.
Yeah. And I think it is common, sorry, printer fired up by me here. I think it's common too for the legislature to go kind of the extra mile to hold up the judiciary as a co-equal branch. Whereas there's no denying the place for the administration. So I think there's that aspect of it too.
Are there any other comments? If not, we will hold this in abeyance until our final meeting on March 19th.
I do have a question, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Peter.
I noticed that in the materials contained in today's agenda, that there were some additional data received, looks like from the judicial branch and the governor's office. I just wondered if staff had gathered that and if you could provide some explanation about the background for that.
Yes, Mr. Chair and Peter, the document that was most recently posted, the 2-page document that includes some information about the recruitment and the challenges that sometimes the Judicial Selection Committee faces, that was provided just prior to the meeting from the governor's office. We had posed some questions based on the council discussion at the last meeting.
And Peter, what the material makes clear is that the situation is different from district to district. The situation being the ability to attract qualified people as candidates for judgeships. It's interesting because in some cases they have very limited candidates and in some they have substantial numbers.
Yeah.
And then I was just going to also reference one additional document that was provided by the Supreme Court, gave some data related to separations and retirements.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, I guess my based on a very cursory review of those materials, I guess it's very difficult for me to discern whether those data points compel a particular outcome, especially given the fairly aggressive request from the District Judges Association. But I guess I'll reserve further commentary for our next meeting.
Are there other comments or questions? You've all been good members of the board today. Is there other business to come before us today? We'll meet again. Michelle, shall we say the same time on the 19th?
Mr. Chair, at our prior meeting, we talked about meeting in the morning on the 19th. And so the council's original schedule had been a 10 to noon meeting.
That's
on
fine.
Friday mornings, if that is agreeable.
Yes.
Preferred.
Well, thank you all very much.